The morning Harlan Voss dismissed Ted Coburn's bread formula as a hobby project dressed up in lab coat language, he did it without raising his voice. That was the part Ted remembered most clearly afterward. Not the words, not the meeting room with its glass walls and its view of the loading dock, but the quiet in Harlan's voice, the administrative calm of a man who had already moved on before the sentence was finished. Ted had spent 4 years developing that formula. Harlan spent 40 seconds ending it. 3 years later, that same bread, the one Harlan called unmarketable, the one the company's product development board had voted to shelve in a unanimous decision, sat on the shelves of more than 9,000 independent grocery stores across the country. The day the first shipment sold out in under 6 hours, nobody called Ted to tell him. He already knew. He had been watching the numbers the way he watched everything. Quietly, from a distance, with the patience of someone who had stopped needing other people to confirm what he already understood. Ted Coburn had worked at Millstone Baking Company for 11 years before Harlan Voss arrived. He had come in as a junior product formulator at 31, a man with a food science degree from a state university in Ohio, and a habit of spending his breaks reading technical journals at his desk, while everyone else went to the sandwich place across the street. He was not unsociable. He was specific about what he found worth talking about, and most conversations did not meet that standard. His coworkers liked him in the mild, uncomplicated way. People like someone who causes no problems and asks for nothing and occasionally says something so precisely correct that you think about it on the drive home. His workstation had a particular quality that people in the building noticed without commenting on. Every surface held exactly what was needed and nothing else. His testing journals were dated and indexed. His sample containers were labeled in a handwriting so consistent it looked typeset. On the inside panel of his personal cabinet, not a photograph or a sports schedule, but a single index card with a handwritten question. What does the bread know that the baker hasn't asked yet? He had written it himself at 33, during a project that had gone nowhere, and he had kept it because the question had never stopped being useful. Millstone in those years occupied a respectable middle position in the regional baking industry. They supplied institutional accounts, cafeterias, school lunch programs, hospital systems, and had done so consistently and without distinction for 2 decades. The board of directors was composed mostly of men who had been in the building since the company's founding and who measured success in the only terms they had ever needed: volume shipped and margin maintained. They were not interested in innovation, they were interested in not losing what they had. Harlan Voss arrived in the spring as the company's new chief product officer, brought in from a large packaged goods conglomerate in the Midwest, where he had spent 15 years rationalizing product lines, which in practice meant eliminating anything that required explanation. He had a gift for reducing complexity to a single question: will this sell in the first 30 days? Everything else was noise. He came into Millstone with a reputation for efficiency and a mandate from the board to modernize the company's approach to product development, which in their language meant make fewer things and make them faster. Ted noticed him the first week, not with concern, but with the attention he gave to anything that might affect the work. Harlan moved through the facility the way people move when they have already decided what they think and are gathering evidence to support it rather than challenge it. He spent 4 hours in the production facility on his second day, asked detailed questions about throughput and packaging waste, and none about flavor development or fermentation chemistry. Ted filed this observation in the same part of his mind where he kept everything that was factual and might later be relevant. The project Ted had been developing for 4 years did not have an official name inside Millstone Systems. In his own notebooks, in the cramped technical shorthand he used when he was thinking quickly, he called it the slow build. The name was descriptive rather than poetic. The bread he was working toward required a fermentation process that took 4 times longer than Millstone's standard production timeline, used a microbial culture he had isolated and cultivated himself over 18 months, and produced a loaf with a shelf life, a texture, and a nutritional profile that no commercial bread he was aware of had achieved simultaneously. The process was counterintuitive in the way that most genuinely original ideas are counterintuitive. It required slowing down in an industry that had spent 50 years learning to go faster. He had been told twice by the previous product development director that it was interesting but not scalable. He had continued anyway, working in the margins of his official schedule, arriving early and staying late, running small batch tests in the secondary fermentation room that the production team rarely used before 7 in the morning. He had shared the project with one colleague in detail, a quality control specialist named Fran Adler, who had been at Millstone longer than Ted and who had a chemist's habit of asking the second question after everyone else stopped at the first. She had spent 2 Saturdays in the fermentation room helping him document the microbial behavior of the culture at different temperature ranges, and she had said afterward that she could not explain exactly what he was building, but that something about the data made her think it was worth finishing. She had not said it to be encouraging. Fran was not built for encouragement. She said it because the data supported it, and with Fran, that was the only reason anything got said. The board presentation where the slow build was formally reviewed came in Ted's 4th year at the project. He had been given 15 minutes on the agenda, not at his request, but because the previous product development director, before leaving the company, had added it to the calendar as an item of interest. By the time the meeting happened, Harlan Voss had been in place for 6 weeks, and the agenda belonged to him in practice if not yet in title. Ted presented without slides. He had brought 3 loaves, baked at different stages of the fermentation process, and a data binder he had assembled over 4 years. He placed the loaves on the conference table and described the process in the plainest language he could find. Harlan tasted a slice of each slowly and asked good questions. The questions were genuine, not hostile. Ted answered them. When he had finished, Harlan looked at the binder for a long moment, and then looked up and asked the question that mattered most to him and least to Ted. At what production volume does this break even? Ted said the process was not optimized for volume at its current stage. He said that the fermentation timeline and the culture cultivation required a different production model than Millstone currently operated, but that he had a proposed modification to the secondary facility that could be implemented in phases. He said the first phase would take 8 months and require capital equipment investment equivalent to upgrading 2 standard production lines. Harlan said 8 months was 3 product cycles. He said the board's mandate was to have 2 new shelf-ready products in market within 18 months, not to redesign the production architecture for a single experimental formula. He said the company respected Ted's work but that the slow build did not fit inside the current strategic framework. Ted did not argue. The meeting ended, he returned to his workstation and continued. 2 months later there was a memo from Harlan's office. It did not terminate the project. It reallocated the secondary fermentation room to a new packaging efficiency initiative and required all non-approved product development work to cease use of company equipment and materials. It was administrative rather than personal. Ted read it, understood what it meant, and made a single note in his journal, "Finish this somewhere else." The formal termination came in August on a Thursday morning. Harlan was in the room with HR. He was professional and specific. He cited budget restructuring, a reduction in the formulation department, and the elimination of Ted's position as a category. He said the company valued Ted's contributions and that it was a structural decision, not a performance matter. Ted read the separation agreement carefully, found nothing that surprised him, and signed it at the bottom. He shook Harlan's hand because Harlan extended his, and Ted was not built for unnecessary difficulty. He returned to his office and packed his things into a single box: his reference books, his personal testing journals, which were his own and not the company's, a framed reproduction of a fermentation chemistry diagram from a 1961 German technical journal that had hung above his workstation for 9 years, the index card from his cabinet. What does the bread know that the baker hasn't asked yet? Fran appeared in the doorway as he was closing the box. She looked at him the way people look when they have decided not to say the obvious thing. He told her he would be in touch. He meant it. She knew he meant it. That was enough. He sat in his car in the Millstone parking lot for a while before starting the engine. Not grieving, not angry, running a calculation he had been working through in his head for the past week about the fermentation culture that was currently in the 3rd month of a new cycle at a temperature he had never been able to hold steady for this long. The calculation told him something useful. He started the car and drove. The garage belonged to a man named Gil First, who had run a small batch kombucha operation out of a converted industrial space on the edge of the city for 8 years. He and Ted had met at a food science conference in Columbus 3 years earlier and had found, over a dinner that neither of them had intended to last 4 hours, that they shared a specific and unusual set of interests: the behavior of microbial cultures under non-standard conditions, the relationship between fermentation time and flavor complexity, and the general opinion that the commercial food industry had spent the last 40 years solving the wrong problems. Gil called on the 11th day after the termination. He said he had a temperature-controlled room that was not currently in use, a walk-in fermentation chamber with humidity control and 600 square feet of clear floor space. He said it was Ted's if he wanted it and that he did not need a timeline or a business plan. He said he had tasted the bread at the Columbus conference from a small batch Ted had brought in a paper bag, and that he had thought about it approximately twice a week since then. Ted moved in with what he had, his personal culture collection maintained in a portable refrigeration unit he had bought 3 years earlier for exactly this contingency, 2 fermentation vessels that he owned outright, and 4 years of detailed process notes. He rebuilt his workspace in a morning. He ordered the supplies he needed through a specialty ingredients distributor he had worked with personally, paid for them from his savings, and began. Not at the stage where Millstone had left things. He went back further than that. Back to the foundational question he had written on the index card, the one he pinned to the shelf above his new workstation the first afternoon. He went through every assumption in the process from the beginning, looking for the place where the formula was still compromising, still accommodating the constraints of a production environment it no longer needed to fit. He found 3 such places. Each one, when released from the original constraint, opened into something better than what he had been working toward. Gil brought coffee in the mornings and left the rest to Ted. They had been colleagues long enough that Gil understood the difference between checking in and interrupting, and he understood without being told that the answers to any questions he might ask were not ready yet. He trusted the process because he had seen the bread. That was sufficient. Fran came by on a Saturday afternoon 6 weeks after the termination, carrying a soft cooler and a data tablet. She set the cooler down without explanation and opened the tablet to a spreadsheet. She told him she had kept copies of every sensory evaluation form from the internal tastings going back 3 years. She said the forms were technically part of the company's research documentation, but that no one had filed them properly, and they existed only in a folder on her personal drive, which she had backed up to an external device the week before Ted was let go, for reasons she preferred not to elaborate on. Ted looked through the data without speaking. Fran drank coffee from a thermos she had brought and did not watch him. After 20 minutes, he stopped at a cluster of results from a tasting 8 months earlier. He read through them twice and said that the panel had responded to a specific textural quality in the second variant that he had attributed to the fermentation temperature on a particular day. He said he had spent a month after that tasting trying to reproduce the temperature condition deliberately, without success. He said that looking at the complete data set, he now understood why. It was not the temperature alone. It was the interaction between temperature and the hydration level of the flour he had used that week, which had been delivered slightly damp after a shipping delay, and which he had not thought to document as a variable. He looked up from the tablet and told Fran that he knew how to reproduce it on purpose. She nodded once, in the way Fran nodded when something confirmed what she had already suspected. She reached into the cooler and produced a container of the starter culture she had been maintaining at his request in her home refrigerator for the past 6 weeks, at conditions he had specified in a text message the day after the termination. She set it on the workbench without ceremony. Ted looked at the container for a moment, and then got back to work. The person who brought the bread to market was a man named Clifton Ware, who had operated a specialty food distribution network in the Mid-Atlantic region for 12 years. Fran had known his sister through a community organization and had passed along a contact after Ted agreed that outside eyes on the finished product were the appropriate next step. Clifton drove to Gil's facility on a Saturday morning in March, arrived 15 minutes early, and spent the first 20 minutes in the fermentation room asking questions about the culture maintenance process before he asked anything about the bread itself. Ted found that sequence reassuring. Clifton tasted 4 variants at different fermentation stages. He ate slowly and asked no questions while eating, which Ted had learned to interpret as genuine attention rather than disinterest. When he finished, he sat for a moment with his hands on the table, looking at nothing in particular. Then he asked a question that no one else had ever asked Ted in the context of this product. Who is the person who needs this bread, and what does their morning look like? Ted was quiet for a moment. He said he thought the person was someone who bought food the way they bought anything that mattered. Not by price, not by habit, but by what it actually did for them. He said he thought that person was underserved by every product currently on the market at every price point, because the industry had optimized for shelf appeal and production cost and had left the actual experience of eating as an afterthought. Clifton said, "That is the most useful thing a product developer has ever said to me." Then he asked how long it would take Ted to produce a reliable run of 500 loaves. Ted said 6 weeks if he had access to the right equipment. Gil, who had been standing in the doorway listening for the last 10 minutes, said the equipment was there. Clifton said he would come back in 6 weeks. He came back 5.5. The first placement was in 22 independent grocery stores in Pennsylvania and Maryland. The stores were selected by Clifton based on customer profiles that matched what Ted had described. No advertising, no promotional placement, no social media campaign. The bread went on the shelf at a price point higher than anything in its category, with a label that described the fermentation process in plain language and made no other promises. It sold out in the first weekend at 19 of the 22 stores. The reorders came in on Tuesday. By the following Friday, 4 additional stores had called Clifton asking to be added to the distribution list. Ted was already running the next fermentation cycle. Gil had quietly cleared a second room. Fran called on the Thursday after the first weekend. She said she had driven to one of the stores and bought a loaf and eaten half of it standing in her kitchen before she had put on her coat. She said this in the same flat, factual tone she used for everything. Ted thanked her in the same tone. There was no other appropriate register for either of them. The expansion happened in stages, the way things do when the work itself is driving them rather than a marketing strategy. Clifton was methodical, and Ted was grateful for it. Each new market was a deliberate choice, not a sprint. The culture could not be rushed. That had always been the point. 8 months after the first placement, the bread was in just over 300 stores. The number had grown not from advertising but from the particular velocity of word of mouth in communities where people talked to each other about food the way other people talked about other things they took seriously. Small food publications had written about the fermentation process. A nutrition researcher at a university in Virginia had written about the bread's probiotic profile in a journal article that got picked up by 2 general audience publications. The day the count crossed 9,000 stores, Ted was in the fermentation room at Gil's facility at 6 in the morning, checking the temperature logs from the overnight cycle. He knew the number because Clifton had sent a message the evening before. He read the message once and put his phone in his pocket and finished checking the logs. What Harlan Voss did next was something Ted learned about from Fran, who still worked at Millstone and still maintained the same careful professional distance between her official position and everything she observed in the building. She sent a message on a Wednesday afternoon without explanation. "You might be getting a call." The call came from Harlan directly, not from an assistant, not from a business development contact. Harlan's voice on the phone had the same administrative quality Ted remembered from the conference room, the voice of someone who had made a decision and was now executing it. He asked if Ted would be open to a conversation. Ted said he was. They met at a coffee shop equidistant between Millstone and Gil's facility. Harlan arrived exactly on time and ordered nothing until after he had sat down, which Ted registered as a minor change from the man who used to stand at the production line talking while everyone around him adjusted. He opened the conversation with a technical question, not a preamble, not an apology with framing, a technical question about whether the fermentation culture was proprietary and whether the process was currently protected. It was the right question. It told Ted that Harlan had done his homework and understood what he was actually asking about. Ted told him the culture was developed independently, on his own time, outside company resources, and was fully his intellectual property. He said the process had been documented in his personal notebooks continuously since before his employment at Millstone, which meant the timeline predated any claim the company might otherwise have considered. He said this not as a threat but as a fact that needed to be in the room. Harlan listened without interrupting. When Ted finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then Teddy said, "I made the wrong call." He said it without the architecture of explanation around it. No context that would make it understandable, no recounting of the pressures he had been under, no language that would soften the shape of it. 4 words in the plainest form he had available. Ted looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation and nodded once. The conversation that followed was not an apology extended. It was a negotiation conducted between 2 people who understood what the other one had. Harlan represented a production capacity that Clifton's network could not currently match at the scale the demand was beginning to require. Ted represented a process and a culture that no amount of Millstone's infrastructure could replicate without his direct involvement. Ted told Harlan that any arrangement would require a full licensing structure that kept process control in his hands. He said it would require a production timeline measured in quarters, not weeks, because the culture could not be scaled faster than the biology allowed. He said it would require a distribution arrangement that kept Clifton Ware as the primary commercial partner, because Clifton had built the market and that relationship was not separable from the product. And he said it would require a formal research role for Fran Adler, whose contribution to the data foundation of the project had been material in ways that were not visible from the outside, but were visible to Ted, which was what mattered. Harlan looked at him steadily through all of this. Then he said he would need to review the documentation and bring a proposal back to Ted within 2 weeks. Ted said the documentation was complete and organized, and that Harlan could have a copy that evening if he wanted to start the review promptly. Harlan said he did. Gil was in the fermentation room when Ted came back to the facility that afternoon. He was calibrating the humidity sensors on the secondary chamber, a task he performed every 2 weeks with the same precision he applied to everything in his building. He did not ask how the meeting had gone until he had finished the calibration and written the readings in his log. Then he asked. Ted told him the short version. Gil listened without comment until the end. Then he asked one question: does the bread still get made the right way? Ted said that was the only way the arrangement would work. Gil nodded and went back to the log. After a moment he said, without looking up, that he would need a little more notice next time before clearing rooms for production expansion, and that his facility rate for additional square footage was negotiable but not free. He said the last part without any particular emphasis, and Ted understood it was the closest Gil would come to saying that he expected the arrangement to honor what had been built in this room, in these conditions, by these specific people at these specific hours. Ted said that was understood. The fermentation room at Gil's facility was quieter in the late afternoon than at any other time of day. The temperature held constant. The culture in the vessels went on doing what it had always done, patient and indifferent to everything that had happened around it, converting simple inputs into something that could not be rushed and could not be faked and could not be explained in 30 seconds to a room full of investors. Ted stood at the workbench for a while after Gil left. The index card was there, pinned to the shelf above the documentation binder, slightly crooked the way it always was because the shelf surface was not perfectly level, and he had decided years ago that correcting it was not worth the time. What does the bread know that the baker hasn't asked yet? He had been asking that question for 12 years. The answers were still coming. That more than the 9,000 stores or the distribution deal or the phone call from Harlan Voss was the part that felt most like success. Not an arrival, but a continuation, the work still open in front of him, the next question already forming at the edge of what he understood. He reached for his journal, opened it to the next blank page, and started writing.